In accordance with Standing Order 43, order the time for members' statements has concluded. Move to questions without notice. Are there any questions without notice? I call the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Since the government's deal with the Senate crossbencher to pass its extreme industrial relations legislation, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Minerals Council of Australia, Master Builders Association, Business Council of Australia have all explicitly reiterated their rejection of the bill, warning jobs and businesses across the country are at risk. Why does this Labor government always get the big economic calls wrong?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. I did think he was reading out a list of the supporters of our climate change policy. Mr Speaker, when he went through that list of the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Business Council of Australia, you left out the National Farmers Federation, who also support our climate policy. But I addressed the Australian Industry Group last Monday night for dinner, and they were all there. I got 7 questions, and I got questions about the relationship with trade. I got questions about The Voice, who, by the way, the Australian Industry Group support. I got questions about the Republic. You want to know how many questions I got about wages? 1.
The member for Fisher.
And this Wednesday night, I'll be the guest speaker at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Over there in the Great Hall. So if you're not doing anything Wednesday night, Pete, come past, have a listen, and you'll hear about our engagement with the business community. Because one of the things that we know when it comes to economics and the big calls is that low wages have been holding back our economy.
That's right.
How do we know that? Well, this is what people have spoken about. A fellow who might know something about the economy, the RBA governor, said the crisis is really in real wage growth. And when speaking about whether there would be higher wages in the future, if that were to happen, it would be a good thing. He said that in 2017. Just to make sure it wasn't, a one-off comment, in 2018 he said—
The member for O'Connor.
He said in an address to the Australian Industry Group, these concerns are being brought into sharp focus by unusually slow growth in wages. And then he went on to say wages growth has not responded in the way that it once did. He went on to say it is clear that slow growth in wages is affecting our economy. He went on in November 2018 in an address to CEDA. He said this. Flat real wages are diminishing our sense of shared prosperity. The lack of real wage growth is one of the reasons why some in our community question whether they are benefiting from our economic success. We believe in an economy that works for people, not the other way around. It's a fundamental distinction that we have. We stand by our position, and indeed the Leader of the National Party said just a couple of weeks ago, would you concede that wages didn't rise while you're in government? Well, real wages didn't, and that's structurally a challenge we're all facing. Concluded. It takes structural change. We're going to deliver that change.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. After a successful 6 months of delivering for the Australian people, what is the Albanese Labor government progressing in this final week of Parliament?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Bendigo for her question. I congratulate her on a good weekend that the member for Bendigo had. In our first 6 months, we've moved Australia forward after a decade of delay and denial and inaction under the previous government. Already we're delivering on what the Australian people voted for. We've made childcare cheaper, we'll make medicines cheaper, we've increased the minimum wage and secured a pay rise for aged care workers. We've established new climate targets. We've repaired our international relations. And this week, we're setting about delivering on more of our commitments. Just this morning, we were able to pass through the parliament, having accepted the amendments of the Senate, the Respect at Work legislation. 2 years ago, women in their many thousands marched on Parliament here, but marched around the country to say enough is enough, to say that we needed to act to ensure that all workplaces were safe and respectful. Today's legislation will do that. This week, we're also committed to advancing the National Anti-Corruption Commission that's already passed this House. It may well be that the opposition and the minor parties combine to try and stifle that, but we're determined to have a National Anti-Corruption Commission based upon the legislation that passed this House, that this House unanimously voted for. We'll also move to advance our Secure Jobs Better Pay bill. We know those opposite, before they'd even read the legislation, decided, once they heard the title, to oppose the legislation, because they're not in favour of secure jobs and they're certainly not in favour of better pay. But what this will do is get wages moving. It will close the gender pay gap. It will ban pay secrecy clauses. It will advance the interests of working people and make sure that we have an economy that works for people, not the other way around. We'll also report to Parliament this week on closing the gap, and we'll report with the first annual climate statement in accordance with the legislation that we passed earlier this year. Australians have made it clear, after a wasted decade, that they want a government that won't waste a day, and that is what we are delivering. We're determined to be worthy of the trust that's been placed in us. We have a mandate to secure change. Australians voted for that change, and that is what the Labor government will be delivering.
Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Small Business. Labor's regulation impact statement for its extreme industrial relations bill says small business will have to pay at least $14,600 in bargaining costs. Can the Minister advise the House whether the Albanese government will provide direct financial compensation for small businesses to deal with this financial hit, or will Labor force small businesses to cop the bill themselves?
Give the call to the Minister for Small Business, Minister for Housing and Minister for Homelessness.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for her question. As I said in this place last week, there are several thresholds that need to be met in terms of small businesses. If she's talking about the single interest bargaining stream, we of course made announcements that that will change from fewer than 15 employees to fewer than 20. So
the Deputy Leader has asked a question.
There are 4 streams, and we do expect that most small businesses will actually go through the cooperative stream, where, as I also said last week, most of the businesses will be able to take an off-the-shelf product or work with their employer peak organisation. So those costs are estimates only, and they're unlikely to be required for most small businesses to meet those costs.
Give the call to the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. What is the impact of the Albanese Labor government's amendments to the Secure Jobs Better Pay bill?
Give the call to the Minister for the Leader of the House.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lingiari for the question. Somebody who knows that whether workers are in the cities, in the regions or in remote areas, it's about time they had a pay rise, and I thank the member for the question. It's clear from the negotiations that have been going on for some time and that continued over the course of the weekend that this week the Secure Jobs Better Pay bill will become law. In doing that, I want to take the House through some of the amendments that have been agreed to by the government in the negotiations both with the Greens and with Senator David Pocock. While consultation continues with all crossbenchers, I want to go through what's now been agreed and what secures passage of the bill. I want to thank the member for Melbourne and Senator Barbara Pocock for the negotiations that have been taking place, which will lead to amendments that make sure, with respect to some further amendments to the Better Off Overall test, that it will still be becoming simpler and fairer, but specific amendments to make sure that there is a guarantee that no worker can be worse off. And I also want to acknowledge the amendments, that's something that Senator Barbara Pocock has pushed for a very long time, to improve flexibility at workplaces, including arbitration on unpaid parental leave. The amendments that Senator David Pocock has pursued to the bill go to a few areas, but many of them focus on the impact on small business. By taking in the single interest stream the small business exemption from 15 to 20 employees, it means that 97.5% of Australian businesses are excluded from that stream. 97.5% excluded if they want to be excluded, but obviously the right to opt in remains there. There'll be a statutory review of the legislation 2 years after the bill, within 2 years of the bill passing. I note that that by 2 years we'll know whether or not Senator Cash was right and whether Australia had in fact been completely shut down. But we're bravely waiting 2 years to be able to have the statutory review. There'll be an increase in the period in which the Fair Work Commission there'll be an increase from 6 months to 9 months from the expiry date, where there's a history of effective bargaining before an employer can be brought into a multi-employer bargaining. In the single interest stream, the Fair Work Commission will have to be satisfied that the various employers within there are reasonably comparable. Similarly, there will be an easier way for employers, if they don't want to be part of a multi-employer bargain, if they have fewer than 50 employees, for that case to have to be made by others to the Fair Work Commission rather than the onus being on them. With all of these different ways, it basically means the sky that will fall in arguments from those opposite. While I know they'll continue to make it for the rest of the week, people know it's not true. People know it's not true, and this bill will
time has. Before I call the member for Clark, I'd like for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, last week I revealed evidence of Australian coal exporters using fake quality tests. This prompted other industry insiders to contact me and corroborate the claims, and the Financial Review reported that the former government was aware of the fraud and buried the allegations. Prime Minister, will the government establish a parliamentary inquiry to investigate this misconduct? And please don't say it's a matter for ASIC, because clearly they're part of the problem.
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Clark for his question, and I also acknowledge his long record of working with whistleblowers and working to ensure greater transparency in the way that politics and business and indeed our economy is conducted in this nation. We certainly take seriously any allegations like this, and indeed they were very serious allegations that was put forward, and because it goes to not just the issue of honesty in an abstract sense, this goes to our reliability as a trade partner, a reliable and trusted exporter of energy, which Australia has the reputation of being, as well as other goods. And it is critical that Australia's reputation as being reliable and trusted be maintained in the future, because it is so important for our relations with our major trading partners, including Japan and South Korea, but other nations as well. But it's also important for our economy, because the Australian economy receives substantial benefit when we export our resources, and that is one of the facts that goes into paying for our schools and our hospitals and our other services. We expect all Australian companies to act with integrity and transparency and uphold the highest standards of corporate disclosure. The government is investigating how to utilise our existing powers to identify any evidence of a systemic practice of altering coal certificates, and I will certainly commit to ensuring that the member for Clark is directly consulted as part of that process. I'm pleased also to advise the member for Clark that The Department of Industry, Science and Resources is engaging with the relevant regulators and accreditation bodies to assess the matter. If there's sufficient evidence, relevant authorities should and will investigate. Integrity is the cornerstone of my government. That's why we've introduced a powerful anti-corruption commission, but measures like this should be examined. I didn't see the financial review report.
Prime Minister,
that you
will pause, and I'll hear from the member for Clark.
Thank you, Speaker. On relevance, and in particular whether a parliamentary inquiry will be established into this matter.
The Prime Minister is answering the question. I'll give him the call.
Thanks very much, the member for Clark. As I said, what we're doing is the department is currently engaging with the regulators and accreditation bodies, making an assessment of it. I guarantee to come back to the member for Clark about that, and I've said already that he will be engaged as part of that process, and then we will make a decision as to whether that would be appropriate.
Call to the member for Reid.
Yeah. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. How will the Albanese Labor government's workplace relation reforms support women and drive gender equality?
Call to the Minister representing the Minister for Women.
I thank the member for Reid for her question. She is one of the 57 women in the Labor caucus and has a powerful backstory that makes me proud, her family proud, and should make us all proud. This is an important issue with crucial social and economic implications. The Albanese Labor government is deeply committed to advancing gender equality. I am proud to be part of a team where 52% of Labor members and senators are women and 10 members of Cabinet are women, the most ever. And our reforms through the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill will take long overdue steps to address the gender pay gap, get wages moving and support secure work for women as well as safety in the workplace. In 2022, none of these things should be beyond us as a nation. Mr. Speaker, this bill puts women at the heart of the Fair Work system by setting clear expectations that the Fair Work Commission must consider gender equality when performing all of its functions, and setting the minimum wage when considering changes to awards and other matters. We are establishing a pay equity expert panel and a care and community sector expert panel with Fair Work Commission supported by the Fair Work Commission supported by a dedicated research unit. The bill will support improved wages and conditions for early childhood education workers, cleaners, community service workers and others in the highly feminised sector. This bill will also address the significant hurdles in the Fair Work Act. These hurdles often stand in the way of women in underpaid and undervalued industries obtaining equal remuneration order. Our reforms will increase pay transparency and strengthen access to flexible working arrangements so families can better share and manage their caring responsibilities. And where the previous government refused to act, this bill will prohibit sexual harassment under the Fair Work Act, a recommendation of the Respect at Work report. I want to pay tribute, as the Prime Minister did earlier today, to the many brave actions of women who brought this into the light. These reforms are just one aspect of this government's ambition for Australia to be a leader on gender equality and our commitment to support women's economic equality and safety in the workplace.
The call to the member for Hume.
Here, Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. In response...
Order. Members on my right. Order. The members on my right... Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting all at once, and I'm going to invite the member for Hume to be heard in silence while he asks his question. Give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In response to a question on insiders on the 21st of November last year, the Treasurer said industry-wide bargaining was, and I quote, not part of our policy. Did the Treasurer mishear that question, or does he have a different excuse for this broken promise?
You be called to the order. The member for Hume was heard in silence. The Treasurer will also be heard in silence. And I give him the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We've waited 19 days for that rubbish question from the member for Hume, Mr Speaker. Did you know, Mr Speaker, Dolly Parton wrote Jolene and I Will Always Love You in one day. It took the Shadow Treasurer 19 days to write that question, 19 days longer than it took to write two of the most popular songs in history. Mr Speaker,
member for Page. Order. Members on my left. The Treasurer will return to the question.
Mr Speaker, the question that the Shadow Treasurer asks me, which Dennis Shanahan wrote 2 or 3 weeks ago, is based on a completely wrong premise.
That's right.
Completely wrong premise. And it comes as a surprise to nobody on this side of the House that the Shadow Treasurer has again got it hopelessly wrong. And let me explain it to the Shadow Treasurer. It was not our policy then, and it is not our policy now, to have industry-wide bargaining. There are important differences between the question I was asked last year and our policy now, as outlined by the Industrial Relations Minister and the Prime Minister and others. And after industrial relations being such a central part of the political debate in this country for some time, the Shadow Treasurer really ought to know the difference between the two concepts. So I say once again for the Shadow Treasurer, it is not our policy now to have industry-wide bargaining. It was not our policy to have industry-wide bargaining when David Spears asked me in 2021. I'll tell you what it is our policy, Mr Speaker. It is our policy to get wages moving again in this country. And that's why I'm so pleased and why I congratulate the Industrial Relations Minister, the Prime Minister, the colleagues in the Senate, Senator Pocock, and I thank him for his support, because for too long in this country wages have been stagnant. And one of the reasons why we're on this side of the House and you're on that side of the House is because we take a very different approach to wages than you do. And nothing would make them happier.
Order.
Nothing would make them happier than another decade of wage stagnation like the last decade. But we take a different approach. They get sent to this place to diminish and hack at the wages and working conditions of working Australians. We come here to get wages moving again. We're proud to do so, and that's what our policy is all about.
We call to the member for McEwen.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How is the Albanese Labor government building transparency and accountability into its decisions to support Australia's most disadvantaged citizens?
I give the call to the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for McEwen for his question and for all the work that he does to support the most disadvantaged in his electorate. Of course, the Albanese government has, from the time it's been elected, been bringing people together to solve some of the very complex issues in our community. And of course, the Jobs and Skills Summit was one of those that brought together all sides of the community to look at how we boost economic participation. And of course, over the weekend, the Prime Minister announced the next step in how we bring people together to tackle economic inclusion and how we ensure that the most disadvantaged in our community are supported. Of course, this comes off the back of the agreement we have got with our Secure Jobs Better Pay bill, a piece of legislation that very much will support some of our most lowest paid workers in this country. But of course, we need to also look at those who have been excluded from the workforce. And our commitment to establish an Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee is the next part of ensuring we have a transparent process run by an expert legislative committee to give this government important advice. This committee will be tasked with providing advice to government on economic inclusion, including policy settings, systems and structures, and the adequacy and effectiveness and sustainability of income support payments ahead of every federal budget. This Labor government wants to do everything we can to address the challenges faced by everyday Australians. And while we know that there's many competing priorities on the budget and, of course, fiscal pressures that must be handled responsibly, it is the Labor way that every budget we hand down, we consider how we can support those doing it the most tough. Of course, the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee will be an important resource and will bring together members of our community, whether they be experts in the community, whether they be advocates, union and business, bringing people together to examine very carefully the issues confronting our most disadvantaged. The Treasurer and I will make these appointments with the committee to be established in an interim capacity to inform the 23-24 budget before legislating this committee on an ongoing basis. High-level recommendations and findings of the committee will be released publicly at least 2 weeks prior to each federal budget. This is an example of where the Albanese government isn't afraid of expert advice. We're not afraid of bringing people into the tent, and we're not afraid of transparency. We will continue to work collaboratively across the community to get good outcomes for those most disadvantaged here in Australia.
Call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Minister for Small Business. Last Thursday, the Minister told the House in question time that a small business located in a shopping centre with a large supermarket would not be compelled to bargain together with that supermarket. Given the bill specifically mentions geographical location as establishing the common interest that means a business can be dragged into multi-employer bargaining, will the Minister now admit she misled the House in giving this incorrect answer?
Give a call to the Minister for Small Business, Housing and Homelessness.
No, I did not. It's correct, and I'll hand over to the Workplace Relations Minister.
Give a call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace. Order. Give a call to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Members on my left. The Minister.
The example given is wrong for 2 reasons. The first reason is in terms of common interest. To claim that a small shop like that has a common interest with a company like Woolworths really beggars belief. Really beggars belief. And if that's their concept of what a common interest is, then they have no understanding of small business on that side. If their view of small business is, oh, it's just the same as Woolies, then that's a really extraordinary argument. But the other concept, if they paid attention over the weekend, is one of the additional amendments that the government's agreed to is whether or not businesses are reasonably comparable. And so, even if you got over the hurdle, and I don't know logically how you could get over the hurdle on common interest, but even if you got there, to claim that they're somehow reasonably comparable would just beg a belief. Now, even some of the people, it's not like the Fair Work Commission is stacked with Labor Party appointees at the moment. That's not exactly who's adjudicating this. But the example given would not pass the common interest test, would not pass the reasonably comparable test, but obviously will pass the scare campaign test. Keep going, keep shouting at the moon. That's what they're going to do. But anyone who looks at this with common sense could not reach any of the conclusions that those opposite are trying to draw.
Give a call to the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. What will change for Australian workers when the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill becomes law?
Give a call to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations and Minister for the Arts.
Thanks so much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. In terms of what will change, it's clear that quite a lot will change because I heard from Senator Cash that these laws are literally the most radical changes that this country has seen. Most radical ever is what we're talking about. So 2 years after the entire nation went into lockdown, apparently people getting their wages moving is the most radical thing that the country's ever seen. What will happen, and let me go through what will happen immediately on this legislation passing. Immediately you will find that job security and gender equality become objectives of the Fair Work Act. That'll happen straight away. The sunsetting of zombie agreements will start. Now, we talk about zombie agreements. What are they? There are still people today working under AWAs from the Howard era. There are still people today working under AWAs. And what has happened is, even though the base rate, the hourly rate, is protected, every penalty rate has disappeared. So there are people now under agreements that would never pass any form of no disadvantage or better off overall test, and they are working on sub-award conditions now. This bill, that those opposite us say everything in the bill is terrible, will make sure that people catch up with what's meant to be the legal rate of pay in Australia again. There'll be a ban on job ads where a job ad advertises less than the legal minimum rate. Now, apparently those opposite think everything in the bill's terrible and it's okay to advertise for less than the legal minimum rate. But in the Senate, already in the House and in the Senate, they'll be voting to keep that rort open. At the moment, if you have a pay equity case, you need to run the case on the basis that you can find a male comparator. So early childhood educators, to try to argue that their work should be more valued, had to argue that their work was similar to being engineers. It was an impossible hurdle, and they failed, and that's part of the reason that we continue to be unable to close the gender pay gap on these various awards. This will allow the gender pay gap to be closed when you no longer have to argue for a male comparator. We'll be prohibiting pay secrecy clauses. Those opposite are wanting to maintain a situation where you are not allowed to tell your fellow workers what you earn, and we know exactly how that has been used. Secure jobs, better pay should be possible in Australia. We'll be voting for it. There'll be a majority in the Senate voting for it, and those opposite should own up that they just want to keep wages low.
Give the call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture. I refer to the example of a Goulburn Valley fruit grower that employs 25 casual and part-time farmhands throughout the year and an additional team of 30 regular seasonal pickers and packers. Under Labor's industrial relations changes, if a representative for fruit pickers from that farm and the neighbour's farm successfully applies to the Fair Work Commission to bargain a single interest employer agreement, could all similar fruit growers be forced into multiple employer bargaining?
The call to the Minister representing the Minister for Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
Thanks very much to the Shadow Minister for his question, and I too, given it is an industrial relations question, will refer to the relevant minister. But I do want to start this.
Order.
Is the proposition that you are putting to this parliament is that regional Australians don't deserve a pay rise? Is that the proposition that you are putting to the parliament?
Order.
Is the proposition
right.
that you are putting to the parliament that people who work on farm communities should be paid
the Leader
lower?
Of the Nationals has
that
asked
is basically the proposition you are putting. You are not supporting regional Australians by putting this question.
The Leader of the
you
Nationals
are
has
saying
asked
that
his question.
anybody who works for farm communities, anybody who works for agricultural and regional businesses does not deserve a pay rise. And I'll ask the Industrial Relations Minister to answer the specifics of the member's question.
I'll call the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations.
Two things, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for joining me to be able to answer the question. Two things on the example that's been given. First of all, in terms of the final line, people don't get forced. Either the employer opts in or the workforce vote to be part of an agreement. That's what happens. People don't get compelled in the way that he's just described. The workforce, those opposite think the only person at the bargaining table is the employer. That's essentially what's at the heart of this. And that's why they can say forced, because they fail to acknowledge the right of the workforce to be able to have a vote as to whether or not they want to be part of something. But of all the industries to come to this House and say, here's an industry where it's outrageous to get pay rises, he chose horticulture.
Minister will pause. I'll call the Leader of the Nationals. On a point of order, members on my right.
Speaker, it is relevance, Mr Speaker. The question is very specific and the minister is going off in terms of the representative for fruit pickers, which means he is venturing away from the actual act and what a representative involved in those negotiations.
You may resume your seat. The question was about employment bargaining. The minister is. The Leader of the Nationals has asked his question. He may not like the answer, but the minister is being relevant regarding employment bargaining, and I'll give him the call.
So I don't blame the farmers for this. I don't blame the horticulturalists themselves, because principally they've been paying rates to labour hire firms that they had a right to believe people were being properly paid. But what has been happening has been the worst examples of people being underpaid that we've seen in Australia have been in that exact industry. And the Leader of the Nationals can scoff at it and say it doesn't matter. When people are being paid $4 an hour, it matters. When people are being paid as little as that, it needs to be fixed. When people are being paid
the Leader of the Nationals
absolutely appalling rates of pay so that they end up fishing out of bins to get food at the back of supermarkets, yes, absolutely we make sure that we will act on those areas. And those opposite, why don't you make one question, have one question at some point, those opposite, that encourages pay rises? Just one. There's been plenty of questions on industrial relations, but not one that has encouraged rates of pay in this country to go up.
When the House comes to the member for Cooper will cease interjecting, so I can hear the member for Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What was discussed at the Albanese Labor government's first investor roundtable?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the member for Caldwell for her question as well. On Friday, the first meeting of the Albanese government's investor roundtable was held in Sydney, and I was pleased to co-host it along with my friend, the Minister for Housing, because what it did was it brought together leading investors, major banks, global asset managers and super funds to promote stronger investment in priority areas, and Friday's focus was affordable housing, and more particularly the housing accord that we announced on budget night, which is all about bringing together investors, state governments, local governments, like that led so ably by my friend Matt Burnett, the Mayor of Gladstone up there in the gallery, and also the building industry and others. And those in the room on Friday represented trillions of dollars of funds under management, all there to see how we can work together to address one of our nation's biggest challenges. And I want to thank everyone who was there in the room, the CEOs of the major banks, the heads of Australia's leading retail and industry super funds, major institutional investors and the Future Fund, leaders in the property sector and community housing, and the ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr, who was representing the state and territory treasurers. So we worked through some of the barriers to large-scale investment in affordable housing, and we talked about financing solutions to encourage greater investment. Now, Mr Speaker, at a time when we've got low vacancy rates and high rents, we need to do what we can to bring people together around the table to solve some of our big economic challenges. And I'm really pleased that there have already been concrete outcomes out of the first roundtable. Just yesterday, the National Australia Bank announced that they've set a new target to lend an additional $6 billion over the next 6 years to build more affordable homes across the country. That will be loaned to social and community housing providers, disability accommodation projects, build-to-rent projects and through some of the government's housing programs as well. Now, the CEO of NAB, Ross McEwen, said that he welcomed the opportunity to contribute to the discussion at the Treasurer's Investor Roundtable. And we welcome this really important contribution from NAB, as well as from other players, Aware Super, AXA, Australian Retirement Trust, HESTA, CBUS and others. Now, this is a terrific start, Mr Speaker, but it's just the start. It is just the start of our work to get more investment into affordable, well-located housing so that people can live closer to where the jobs and opportunities are being created. And it's just the start of our work to help make sure that we can harness trillions of dollars of Australian capital to deliver wins for investors, for super fund members and for the nation.
Before I call the member for Melbourne, I'd like to welcome to the chamber Members from the Regional Development Australia, the Central Queensland Mayors, Tony Williams, Matt Burnett, Andy Ireland and Grant Cassidy, the Chair of Regional Development Australia, Central and Western Queensland. We'll give the call to the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Even though the climate crisis is the biggest threat to our environment, the Minister for Resources said last week that the decision on the future of coal and gas should be made by overseas boardrooms, not by Australia. Do you agree? Or in next week's response to the review of our environment laws, will you announce a climate trigger so that the impact of climate pollution has to be taken into account when considering new coal and gas mines?
The call to the Minister for Environment and Water.
I want to thank the Leader of the Greens for that question. And it goes to two issues. The first is the government's response to the Samuel Review, which was looking at the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Like many things those opposite did, they received the Samuel Review about 2 years ago and never really responded to it. So, of course, we will respond to the Samuel Review. The Samuel Review found two things. The first is that environmental laws have presided over a worsening of our environment. We saw that with the State of the Environment report that those opposite also kept secret, and it found that approvals processes were slow and cumbersome. So we want to do two things. We want to give better environmental protections and faster, clearer decision-making, and our response will go to that. On the issue of coal and gas projects, what we have consistently said on this side is that they will be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and they'll have to meet our environmental laws, they'll have to stack up environmentally and economically. That position hasn't changed.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting and give the call to the member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Attorney General. Why it is important that a National Anti-Corruption Commission has strong powers? Thank you.
Give the call to the Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Tangney for his question. This week is set to be a historic week for this parliament. Australians are expecting this parliament to deliver the National Anti-Corruption Commission that they endorsed at the election. The passage of the two National Anti-Corruption Commission bills that are currently before the Senate will show that this parliament has listened and acted. The government's model for a National Anti-Corruption Commission contained in these bills is a strong watchdog with teeth. This body will have the powers of a standing royal commission. It will be able to commence investigations in its own right and accept anonymous tip-offs. It will have the ability to hold public hearings in exceptional circumstances and where it is in the public interest to do so. Importantly, the National Anti-Corruption Commission will have the necessary powers to root out corruption when it occurs. Just by doing its job, it will have a strong deterrent effect on those who may engage in corrupt activity. This is in stark contrast to the model that was promised but never delivered by the Liberal and National parties. Their proposed body did not allow for public hearings at all. It could not receive anonymous tip-offs or initiate its own inquiries, and it could only investigate matters that reached a criminal threshold. In short, it was a model that was designed not to tackle corruption at all. The Liberal and National Party's model was described by integrity experts as, and I quote, the weakest watchdog in the country that would hide corruption and not expose it. But the Australian people didn't buy it, Mr. Speaker. They knew that those opposite would never
will resume his seat. I'll give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on relevance, you have previously directed a minister to be relevant to the question, where the minister has strayed and begun talking about the record of the former government, and that's exactly what's happening here.
On the point of order, I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the question asked why it was important for the Anti-Corruption Commission to have strong powers. The record of the former government is one of the reasons.
The order, it was a broad order. It was a broad question. I'm going to ask the Attorney-General to focus on the question, not necessarily the former government. but I'll give him the call with 1 minute remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The reason why I mentioned the former government's pathetic model was that this was the contest at the last election, and the Australian people very clearly voted for the model that the Labor Party took to the election and the principles that we outlined at the election. The Australian people didn't buy the model that the Liberal and National parties had, Mr Speaker. They knew that those opposite would never deliver a watchdog with teeth. But we will do it this week. This government stands ready to deliver, and I call on the whole parliament to join us in that task.
Give the call to the member for Forrest.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Small Business. Minister, under Labor's Extreme Industrial Relations Bill, could a local winery in Margaret River be required to bargain with a local pub in Margaret River due to being in the same industry and geographical location?
I'll give a call to the Minister for Small Business, Minister for Housing and Homelessness. The Minister for Skills on my right.
Speaker, I mean, seriously, we keep getting all sorts of analogies from those opposite. We've said they need to be comparable. They need to be comparable. They're clearly not.
The Minister will resume her seat. The Minister will... Has the Minister concluded her answer? Give the call to the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to clean up the mess left by the former government and ensure Australia's submarines meet our national security needs?
Give a call to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank the member for his question and acknowledge the service that he has provided to Australia's national security. Mr Speaker, the Albanese government's one of our greatest challenges is securing Australia's future submarine capability. There is no military platform which gives rise to a greater question mark in any adversary's mind than a highly capable submarine, which is why submarines matter in terms of building Australia's strategic space for diplomacy and for trade. And there is no worse example of the lost decade that Australia has had under the former coalition government than the sheer negligence that they showed in the handling of future submarines. And the rot started very early. Former Defence Minister Johnson declared that he had no confidence that Australia could build a submarine. Indeed, he famously declared that he wouldn't trust Australian defence industry to build a canoe. Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Defence Minister Andrews sought to have our future submarines built by Japan as a bargaining chip to close the free trade agreement with Japan. Talk about the tail wagging the dog. And then in early 2015, the country was treated to the spectacle of Australia's future submarines being tossed around the former government's party room during the empty chair challenge on Tony Abbott. There is no moment where those opposite have shown greater contempt for Australia's defence or the Australian people than this. And then in 2016 we saw those opposite prematurely down-select the bidders for the future submarine to one without competing the design of the submarine, a decision which involved billions of dollars so that they could have a slightly more convincing press conference on the eve of the 2016 election. And what is consistent with all of this is that the Liberals love the politics of defence but have zero interest in defence policy. Well, under the Albanese government, things are very different because we're not concerned about politics, we're only interested and focused on the national interest. There is a power of work underway right now with our partners in the United Kingdom and the United States about what will be the optimal pathway for Australia's future nuclear-powered submarine, and we're on track to be able to make that announcement in the first part of next year. And building a nuclear submarine in this country will be one of Australia's great national endeavours. It will transform our strategic posture, it will build our sovereignty and it will empower Australia as a nation.
Give the call to the honourable member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Sales of Australian-made Prosecco now exceed $200 million annually, the result of the sector investing millions of dollars in the wine variety. The European Union is now pushing for Prosecco to be added to the list of food and drinks covered by geographical indication protection under the existing wine agreement. What is the government doing to protect Prosecco growers, including in my electorate of Mayo?
The call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Mayo for her question and for her and mine and many others' interest in Prosecco, which is indeed a fantastic product, much of which is grown, of course, in South Australia. We are currently negotiating with the European Union about a free trade agreement, and as part of that, I met with the new Italian Prime Minister when we were together at the G20 meeting. The first meeting that has taken place between an Australian Prime Minister and an Italian Prime Minister for some period of time. And at that bilateral meeting I put forward Australia's interests in advancing the free trade agreement. We know that in terms of the agricultural sector in particular, with nations such as France and Italy, they have been very protective of particular labels of products. But the truth is that Prosecco is a product that is produced not just in Italy, just like roses are grown in lots of places around the world, and they're still roses. We will advance Australia's national interest and negotiate in good faith with the European Union, and I'm hopeful that the European Commission will send their leaders, Ursula and Charles, out here next year. I've invited them to come out and to meet with business, including the agricultural sector, next year. There is much to be gained by a free trade agreement with Europe. When we think about the issues that have been raised with free trade agreements, they often relate to labour laws and relative costs. When you're talking about Europe, you don't have those issues. What you can have is a win-win agreement, and that is why the entry fee for negotiating with Europe was a decent climate change policy, and that was indicated very clearly by the European Commission, by not just the Italian Prime Minister, but the Spanish Prime Minister, the French President, the German Chancellor. Australia is now in a position whereby we're able to promote our national interest. We'll do so in good faith. We understand that these are challenges and that our friends in Europe starting position is different from ours, but we'll negotiate in good faith and we'll consult with industries, including the agricultural sector, as we do it.
Give the call to the honourable member for Chisholm.
Thanks so much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure. What is the Albanese Labor government's response to the known views of Victorians in relation to the suburban rail loop east?
Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure. Order. Members on my left, it's far too much noise. Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Chisholm for her question, a fine representative of the southeastern suburbs of Victoria. I know she, like many Victorians, is a very keen supporter of the suburban rail loop. On this side of the House, we've been long supporters of the suburban rail loop. We know that planning for our medium to long-term future requires vision, requires dedication and a commitment to work cooperatively with states and territories. The suburban rail loop will be truly transformational to the state of Victoria. The first section, Suburban Rail Loop East, is a project delivering twin tunnels with 6 underground stations at Cheltenham, Clayton, Monash, Burwood, Glen Waverley and in Box Hill. It's due to open in 2035. It will open up access to key education, health and employment centres in Melbourne's east and south-east. The benefit will also go to people in the Latrobe Valley and Gippsland, who will be able to access Monash University, the newly opened Heart Hospital and Monash Children's Hospital, all without needing to head into the centre of Melbourne, saving them an hour on public transport for that trip. It's a project that will relieve pressure on our roads, as well as reduce congestion and travel times across our suburbs. It's significant investment in transformational public transport. That is what Labor governments do. Suburban Rail Loop East will also support up to 24,000 jobs in the construction phase. Early works are already underway right now in Clayton, and they'll begin in Glen Waverley early in the new year. Preparatory works are also about to kick off at Burwood and Monash and at Box Hill, ahead of construction of the new Box Hill Suburban Rail Loop station. The Albanese government has committed $2.2 billion to the early works of Suburban Rail Loop East. The detailed business and investment case of the loop, released by Victoria last year, demonstrated a benefit-cost ratio of up to 1.7, meaning $1.70 would be returned for every dollar investment. This is a completely transformational project for the state of Victoria. It's a project that has the support of our government, and it's pretty clear from Saturday that it has the overwhelming support of the Victorian community as well.
I give the call to the member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. I refer to the front page headline of the Saturday Telegraph, "Give back medals, shock backflip." Can the Minister confirm to the House that his review into command accountability covers all honours awarded to officers who commanded at the tactical through to the national level, from the captains to the generals, during the period covered by the Brereton Report?
Give the call to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence.
Well, I thank the member for his question. And let me just say that it is unusual to receive a question from the Shadow Minister, given the personal experience that he's had, not just in service but in respect of this. And I want to say up front, I very much acknowledge his service in Australia's Defence Force, but more than that, and he knows my feelings about this, the member opposite in respect of this issue is a very brave man. And Australia owes him a debt of gratitude for what he has done in respect of this. What has happened in relation to the allegations that were made under the Brereton inquiry is obviously a matter of national shame. But what we can take encouragement from is that the Brereton inquiry, to the credit of the former government, is Australia dealing with its own issues. And so it goes to who we are as a people. And it is a fundamentally important report, and one which needs to be treated with the utmost respect, and I very much know that the honourable member knows that better than anyone in this place. And so our predisposition here is to be seeing that we fully implement, to the extent that we can, the Brereton report. Now, there were 143 recommendations of the Brereton report. The former government dealt with 101 of them. I want to make clear that there is no intention to review any of the decisions that the former government made in relation to those 101 recommendations, and particularly in respect that the Leader of the Opposition made when he was the Defence Minister in respect of the meritorious unit citation. None of that is under review.
The Defence Minister will pause, and I'll hear from the member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just on relevance, I ask the Minister to go to the substance of the question, which goes to command accountability and whether or not captains and generals during the period identified in the Brereton report will be subject to the same review.
Give the call to the Minister for Defence, who is being relevant to the question, with 1 minute to go.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Of the 42 recommendations that had not been implemented, that we've in a sense inherited in terms of our managing of this, our intention, in answer to the question, is to implement Brereton to the fullest possible extent, given what I have just said. Now, one of those recommendations called on the review of the award of decorations to those in command positions at troop, squadron and task group level during particular Special Operation Task Group rotations. What we've seen in the last week or two is the Chief of the Defence Force writing to a small number of people to whom this recommendation concerns. We completely support the Chief of the Defence Force in the steps that he has taken. I can't disclose the number for privacy reasons, but what I will say is that in terms of this recommendation and all others, it is our intent to try and implement Brereton to its fullest possible extent, which I know the member opposite would want this government to do.
I'll give the call to the member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. How is the Albanese Labor government working with states and territories, in particular Western Australia, to ensure we're addressing the skills shortage that the government has inherited?
I give the call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Well, thank you, Speaker. Can I thank the member for Swan for her question and her interest in the vet sector in her electorate and beyond in her great state of Western Australia. Can I say, as I think members know, that when we were elected we inherited not only just $1 trillion of public debt, we inherited a massive skills deficit across the economy. And for that reason, the Prime Minister called a Jobs and Skills Summit, which of course from that summit we had an announcement on 180,000 fee-free TAFE and vet places, which is providing certainty for the vet sector to provide the courses that students and existing workers need to fill the skills gaps across the economy in sectors and occupations across the economy. And of course, the National Skills Commission's last report, and this really does explain, I think, Speaker, the scale and breadth of the problem. The actual National Skills Commission report showed that there had been almost a doubling of occupations on the shortage list in 12 months. From 153 to 286 occupations, which really does explain how important it is for us to get this right. Now, the other metric I think that's really important and relevant to the House is if you look at the completed trade apprenticeships in 2012, it was 57,000. In 2021, 20,000 fewer completed trade apprenticeships in the vet sector, which really means that we need reform in the vet sector as well as supplying the investment to provide the courses for the skills that are needed in our economy. Now, I'm very happy to announce today the Minister for Education and Skills, Minister Ellery, and I signed an agreement between the Commonwealth and Western Australia for an agreement for that great state. So it now has an extra 18,800 places in areas of shortages. That's right. We've got an extra, with thousands more in aged care, agriculture, construction, hospitality, tourism, all those areas in the economy that are crying out for skills. A very important announcement by, of course, the Commonwealth and Western Australia. It really does speak to the need for us to work very closely with state and territory governments. When we came to office, there was no agreement in place, no national skills agreement, no agreement between the previous government and one state or territory government. Not one government had signed up to the National Skills Agreement. Well, we're getting on with the job. This is the third jurisdiction that has signed up. There will be many more agreements that will be made prior to the end of this year. We are getting on with the job, supplying the skills to the labour market, to, of course, employers that are desperate for the skills in this economy, and we'll keep doing that until we get it right.
Just as time has concluded. Give the call to the member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Prime Minister indicated Labor had secured a deal with Senator Pocock to ensure the passage of Labor's Extreme Industrial Relations Bill. Can the Prime Minister inform the House if there are any elements of this deal which have not been made public?
Order. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Wide Bay for his question, and as I understand it, he's asking if there are any secret elements of any arrangements that were put forward as part of an agreement to pass our industrial relations legislation. Let me get this right. The political party that has a secret agreement as the basis of the forming of government between the Liberal Party and the National Party is asking, are there any elements that are unknown? They didn't even know who their ministers were.
Order.
Didn't even know. You had, you had 2 treasurers, 2 finance ministers, 2 health ministers, 2 industry, science, etc. ministers, and no one was allowed to know. And they come in here and give a newbie a question like that. What a joke.
Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? 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 The member for Adelaide will resume his seat. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
On relevance, Mr Speaker, when there's been a tightly drafted question, you previously asked the Minister to come back to the terms of the question. Are there any elements of the deal with Senator Pocock which have not been made public?
The Prime Minister has had a preamble, and I'll ask him to return to the question. He is being in order, but I'll give him the call.
Mr Speaker, they probably don't recognise someone of integrity like Senator Pocock, who's been upfront about everything that was discussed and nothing that wasn't. It's been very upfront, as have I. And that compares with the opposition, who, when it became known that we weren't aware of how many of these secret ministries were in existence, they had a debate in their shadow cabinet, and according to one frontbencher, they said the view was we were best not to talk about it. Not to talk about it, according to Nikki Saba. Not according to something in the past, something about the way that they're operating now. When embarrassed, when the Australian public find out how many treasurers there were and how many finance ministers, what they say is, we're best not to talk about it. Well, I did a press conference yesterday with the Minister for Industrial Relations and talked about exactly what was discussed between myself and Senator Pocock. Senator Pocock did a press conference. It's called transparency. We've got it. You never did, and you still don't.
The member for Petrie does not need to add to the commentary. I give the call to the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Veteran Affairs and Defence Personnel. How is the Albanese Labor government responding to the recommendations put forward by the Commissioners in the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide Interim Report?
Give a call to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Adelaide for his question and his advocacy for his considerable veteran community in the seat of Adelaide. And as I know that he knows, the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide handed down its interim report in August. In the interests of transparency, we made that report public the same day. In September, I was proud to deliver the Albanese government's formal response to the report, responding to each of the 13 recommendations from the Royal Commission. The government agrees with the Royal Commission that urgent and immediate action is required. One of the key recommendations of the Royal Commission was to remove the average staffing level cap at the Department of Veterans Affairs. As a Labor government, we know the importance of secure work. That staffing cap has already been removed. Many of the recommendations go to eliminating the claims backlog at DVA. At the election, Labor committed to employing 500 additional staff for DVA, and I'm proud that more than 200 of those staff have now been employed. The first Albanese Labor government budget also responded to these recommendations. In implementing the government's response to the Royal Commission, not only was $233.9 million put forward for engaging these additional staff, $87 million was allocated to modernise IT systems in DVA to improve claims processing. $24.3 million is allocated to provide increased support to veterans who are having their claims processed and improving modelling capabilities to manage the demand on DVA services. We've also committed $15.5 million to support DVA's continued engagement with the Royal Commission. The Albanese government also committed $9.5 million into developing a pathway for the simplification and harmonisation of veteran compensation and rehabilitation legislation. Work is currently underway on developing that pathway, which we will outline in the new year. The Royal Commission interim report also goes to improving the release of information about deceased family members by Defence and DVA to their loved ones. The Department of Defence and DVA are working with an independent consultant to work with ADF members, veterans, families and representative cohorts to co-design a trauma-informed implementation of these recommendations. Work on these recommendations is on track for completion by March 2023. After years of reports, too many deaths, too many lives changed for the worse and endless discussion, we're actually getting on with the job. Our government is committed to the task of saving lives and ensuring a better future for our defence and veteran communities.
Give the call to the member for Fairfax. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question goes to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Prior to the election, the minister said he would not sign Australia up to a global pledge without knowing how it would be implemented. At COP27, the minister signed Australia up to pay compensation for carbon emissions, without knowing any of the details, including how much it will cost. Minister, how can Australians trust anything you say?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. The member for Bruce. The Minister has the call.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid the honourable member's question underlines just how much they don't understand the international conversation about dealing with developing countries and the impact of climate change, and just how willing they are to play cheap and pathetic politics on this issue, Mr. Speaker. At the COP27 last week, Mr. Speaker, every country in the world, every COP party came together for this agreement. According to the Leader of the Opposition, he would have stood away with his arms folded and said, "We're not in, we're not having this conversation." On this side of the House, we believe that actually interacting with Pacific countries in particular about the impact of climate change on them is central to our agenda, Mr. Speaker. Central to our agenda. Now, there have been some mistruths told by those opposite. Let's just run through them. Let's just run through them, Mr. Speaker. They talk about China. Let's just call it for what it is. They talk about China. In fact, the agreement, reflected in the cover text of the COP meeting, says that this arrangement will be for the particularly vulnerable countries. China is not one of those. Every country is vulnerable to climate change. The most vulnerable are Kiribati and Vanuatu and Fiji. They are the countries that we deal with and we are proud to deal with. The Leader of the Opposition thinks that the impacts of climate change on Pacific Islands is just part of his comedy routine, Mr. Speaker. Not a very good comedy routine, but it's all he's got. Well, we on this side of the chamber actually believe interaction with the developing countries of the Pacific is central to our agenda, and I'm proud of that arrangement, and I'm proud of the work we did together in Egypt, working with the Prime Ministers and climate change ministers of the Pacific. I'm proud of that. I don't run away from that, and on this side of the House, we're proud of that too. Those opposite can take a different approach if they wish. They can hold the Pacific Islands off to one side and say, talk to the hand, we're not interested. We're not interested. Now, the other myth perpetrated by those opposite is that somehow Australia—
the member for Fairfax is seeking the call. Order. On my right, the member for Bruce is warned. I'll hear from the member for Fairfax and I'll ask him to state the point of order briefly.
Relevance. I asked the minister, referring to him breaking a promise, how the Australian people can ever trust anything he says.
You may resume your seat. It is not an opportunity to restate the question. The member for O'Connor is warned. I'll give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The other myth perpetrated by those opposite is somehow Australia agreed to a funding arrangement, when in fact what we agreed to, and every country in the world agreed to, is for further work over the next 12 months on the establishment of a fund, Mr Speaker. And I'll tell you who would have been happiest if Australia had not participated in that. I'll tell you what country, to be frank, would have been happiest. That country is China, Mr Speaker, because that would have sent the message to the Pacific in a geopolitically contested region that Australia is not interested in the Pacific. That just underlines why this man is not fit for the office he seeks to hold. He would be a risk to our national security. He's mentioned in 20 years in parliament, he's mentioned climate change 3 times in that 20 years. That's what the Leader of the Opposition thinks about climate change. His biggest contribution to the climate change discussion in Australia was to joke about the impacts on Pacific Islands, who are fighting for their very survival. That's why he is not fit for the office he purports to seek to hold.
Give the call to the honourable member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. What were the findings and recommendations of the Bell inquiry?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, and I thank the member for Spence for his question. And the Bell inquiry confirmed that the principles of responsible government were, to quote the inquiry, fundamentally undermined because the former Prime Minister was not responsible to the parliament or the public. The inquiry describes how this bizarre behaviour has had, to quote it, a corrosive impact on public trust and confidence in government. The report states that the public didn't know, to quote it, something it was entitled to know. Now, my government will implement all 6 recommendations, and later this week we will introduce legislation to this House to make sure this can never happen again. I've already instructed the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to ensure that there is proper transparency should any appointments be made. The actions of the former Prime Minister were extraordinary, they were unprecedented and they were wrong. They exposed a cult of secrecy and a culture of cover-up which arrogantly dismissed scrutiny as an inconvenience. And members of the former government and current opposition enabled this culture. Remember, they sat back with the Cabinet Committee of 1 and said that that was acceptable. The Leader of the Opposition has made excuses for this behaviour. He just doesn't get it. And Nikki Sava's upcoming book reports the decision by the Shadow Cabinet. According to one frontbencher, the view was we were best not to talk about it. And today, the manager of opposition businesses said that they won't vote for a censure motion on the basis that, according to him, the issue of relationship between the former PM and his ministers is a matter for them. They still don't get it. It's not about you, it's about the Australian people and whether they have a right to know who the ministers are. It's about the Westminster system of our parliamentary democracy and whether it has been undermined. They just don't get it, but we'll give them the opportunity to have a say on that, and they will be held to account for it. Together with the NAC, tighter ministerial standards and our embrace of the Jenkins Review, we're working hard to restore faith in our institutions and strengthen our democracy. They should never be called Conservatives, because Conservatives support institutions. Those opposite undermine them at every single opportunity. I do thank Ms Bell and her team for their excellent work in producing an outstanding report, and on that basis, Mr Speaker, I'd also ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.